The dust kicked up around Eleanor's worn boots as she stood frozen at the counter of Morrison's general store, her cheeks burning hotter than the Arizona Territory sun that blazed through the window behind her. She had just asked for credit on basic supplies: flour, beans, coffee, and a small tin of lard, and Henry Morrison's face had gone from polite to cold in the span of a heartbeat. "I'm afraid I can't extend credit to you, Miss Eleanor," he said, his voice loud enough that the 3 other customers in the store turned to look. Not to a woman without a husband or family to vouch for her. Eleanor's fingers tightened on the edge of the wooden counter, her knuckles going white. She had known this might happen, but she had hoped, foolishly it seemed, that the 2 years she had lived in Copper Springs would have earned her at least a shred of respect. She had always paid her debts before, back when her father was alive and their small ranch still turned a profit. But that was 6 months ago, before the fever took him, before the cattle rustlers made off with half their herd, before she found herself truly and completely alone. "Mr. Morrison, I have always been good for my debts," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the humiliation crawling up her spine. "I just need a week, maybe 2. The Henderson family said they'd pay me for mending and laundry work." "That may be so," Morrison replied, crossing his arms over his barrel chest. "But I've got a business to run, and I can't be giving handouts to every person who comes in here with a sad story. A woman alone has no business trying to run a ranch anyway. You should have sold that land and moved back east where you belong." The words stung worse than a slap. Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, to defend herself, to explain that she had nowhere back east to go, that this harsh and beautiful territory was the only home she had ever known. But the lump in her throat made speaking impossible. She could feel the stares of the other customers burning into her back, could hear the whispered comments already starting. "How much does the lady owe?" The voice came from behind her, deep and calm, with a slight drawl that marked the speaker as someone who had spent years under open skies. Eleanor turned to see a man she had noticed around town a few times, but had never spoken to. He was tall, with broad shoulders that filled out his faded blue shirt, and a face that was sun-weathered but handsome, with strong features and eyes the color of dark honey. A worn hat sat low on his head, and there was dust on his boots and jeans that spoke of long days in the saddle. Morrison's expression shifted, becoming almost obsequious. "Well now, Mr. Garrett, this isn't your concern. I was just explaining to Miss Eleanor here that I cannot extend credit to." "I didn't ask for an explanation," the cowboy interrupted, his voice still calm but with an edge of steel underneath. "I asked how much she owes." Morrison's jaw worked for a moment before he glanced down at the items Eleanor had set on the counter. $2.30, he said grudgingly. The cowboy, Garrett, Morrison had called him, reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. He counted out the money and placed it on the counter with a deliberate motion. "There, consider her tab paid." Eleanor's throat tightened further, but this time with a different emotion entirely. "Sir, I cannot accept." "Already done," Garrett said, turning to look at her properly for the first time. His eyes were kind, she noticed, despite the hardness that life had clearly carved into him. There were lines at the corners that suggested he smiled often, though he was not smiling now. No sense arguing about it. Morrison swept the money off the counter with barely concealed irritation and began roughly bagging Eleanor's supplies. The other customers had gone silent, watching this exchange with the avid interest of people who would have something to talk about for weeks. Eleanor's face burned again, but now shame mixed with gratitude in a confusing swirl. She was not accustomed to charity, had never wanted it, but she also could not deny that without these supplies, the next week would have been hungry and difficult. When Morrison shoved the bag across the counter toward her, she took it with trembling hands. "Thank you," she managed to say to Garrett, her voice barely above a whisper. He tipped his hat slightly. "You are welcome, miss." Then, as she turned to leave, he added, "If you are heading out of town, I would be happy to walk with you. It's getting on toward evening." Eleanor hesitated. She knew what people would say, what they were probably already thinking. A woman alone accepting money from a strange man, then letting him walk her home. It would be the talk of every dinner table in Copper Springs by tomorrow. But she also knew that the 2-mile walk back to her ranch took her past some rough country, and there had been trouble lately with drifters and men who thought a woman alone was easy prey. "I would appreciate that," she said finally, deciding that her safety mattered more than gossip. They walked out of the store together, and Eleanor could feel Morrison's disapproving glare boring into her back. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the jagged mountains in the west, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber. Copper Springs was not a large town, one main street with perhaps 20 buildings, including the saloon, the hotel, the general store, a church, and a scattering of houses. Beyond that, the land opened up into rolling hills dotted with scrub brush and the occasional stubborn tree. They walked in silence for a few minutes, their boots crunching on the packed dirt road. Eleanor carried her bag of supplies, very aware of the man beside her. He was several inches taller than her own respectable height of 5 feet 6 inches, and he moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin. "I am Eleanor Hartwell," she said finally, feeling that some introduction was warranted given what he had just done for her. "James Garrett," he replied. "Though most folks just call me Garrett, I have been working at the Double R Ranch for about 3 months now." Eleanor nodded. The Double R was one of the larger spreads in the area, owned by Robert Richardson, a man whose reputation for fair dealing had made him moderately wealthy by territory standards. "I thought I had seen you around town." "I have seen you too," Garrett said, and there was something in his tone that made Eleanor glance at him. He was looking straight ahead, but there was a faint color in his cheeks that suggested he had not meant to admit that quite so directly. "I mean, Copper Springs is not so big that folks do not notice each other." Despite everything, Eleanor felt a small smile tug at her lips. "No, I suppose it is not." They passed the last of the buildings and started down the road that led out into open country. The air was cooler now, carrying the scent of sage and dust. In the distance, a hawk circled lazily against the darkening sky. "I hope you do not mind my asking," Garrett said after another stretch of silence, "but are you really out there on your own?" Morrison made it sound like you have been trying to run a ranch by yourself. Eleanor's shoulders stiffened slightly. Here it came, the judgment, the well-meaning advice that she should give up and admit that a woman could not handle such work. "My father died 6 months ago," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "The ranch is small, only about 200 acres, and we are down to maybe 30 head of cattle after rustlers hit us in January. But yes, I am managing it alone." "That must be hard work," Garrett said, and Eleanor braced herself for the rest of it. But instead of telling her to quit, he asked, "Do you have help at all? Someone to assist with the heavy labor?" "I had a ranch hand until last month, but I could not afford to keep paying him," Eleanor admitted. "I have been doing what I can myself. I take in mending and laundry from some of the families in town, which brings in a little money, and I have been selling eggs from my chickens." "It is not enough, though," Garrett said quietly. It was not a question. "No," Eleanor said, the word heavy with 6 months of struggle and worry. "It is not enough, but I do not have any other options. My mother died when I was born, and my father never remarried. I have no other family, no husband, no inheritance beyond the ranch itself. If I sell it, I will have a little money, but then what? How long would that last? At least with the ranch, I have a roof over my head and the possibility of building something." Garrett was quiet for a moment, and Eleanor wondered if she had said too much, revealed too much of her desperation to this stranger. But when he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful rather than pitying. "I think you are braver than most men I know," he said. "And I grew up around some pretty tough cowboys." Eleanor glanced at him in surprise, and this time he was looking at her, those honey-colored eyes steady and sincere. "You think I am foolish, though," she said. "Everyone else does." "No," Garrett said firmly. "Foolish is giving up on something you love just because it is hard. Foolish is letting other people tell you what you can and cannot do. What you are doing, that is not foolish. That is brave." Something warm unfurled in Eleanor's chest, something she had not felt in a very long time. Hope, maybe, or simply the relief of being seen as something other than a problem to be solved or a woman to be pitied. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means more than you might think." They continued walking, and Eleanor found herself relaxing in a way she had not expected. There was something easy about Garrett's presence, something that did not demand anything from her. He did not fill the silence with empty chatter, but he also did not seem uncomfortable with it. He simply walked beside her, occasionally pointing out a jackrabbit darting through the brush or commenting on the weather. By the time they reached the turnoff that led to her ranch, the sun was touching the mountains, and the sky had turned to fire. Eleanor's property was marked by a simple wooden gate that hung slightly crooked on its hinges, another thing she needed to fix, but had not found the time or energy for. Beyond it, the narrow drive led up a gentle rise to where her small house sat, a modest structure of adobe and wood with a roof that only leaked in two places when it rained. "This is me," Eleanor said, stopping at the gate. "Thank you again, Mr. Garrett, for the supplies and for the company." Garrett tipped his hat to her. "It was my pleasure, Miss Eleanor, and please, just Garrett is fine." Eleanor nodded, then hesitated. There was something she wanted to say, some way to express the gratitude and the strange sense of connection she felt, but the words would not come. Instead, she simply said, "I hope to see you again." "I hope so too," Garrett replied, and the warmth in his voice made Eleanor's heart skip in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. She watched him turn and head back down the road toward town, his figure growing smaller against the blazing sky. Only when he had disappeared from view did she push open the gate and make her way up to the house, her supplies clutched against her chest, and her mind full of thoughts that had nothing to do with cattle or mending or the 100 other worries that usually occupied her. Inside the house, Eleanor set her bag on the rough wooden table that dominated her small kitchen and began putting things away. The house was sparse but clean, with whitewashed walls and a few pieces of furniture her father had made by hand. There was the table and 2 chairs, a narrow bed in the corner, a wood stove for cooking, and a shelf that held her few books and her mother's china teapot, one of the only things her father had kept from his wife. As she worked, Eleanor's mind kept drifting back to Garrett. She knew better than to read too much into a simple act of kindness. Men did not typically court women like her, women without money or family, women who had chosen independence over propriety. And yet, there had been something in the way he looked at her, something in the way he spoke, that suggested his interest might be more than passing. She shook her head, trying to clear it of such thoughts. She had more pressing concerns than romantic fantasies. Tomorrow she needed to ride out and check on the cattle, make sure none had wandered off or been taken by predators or thieves. She needed to fix the loose board on the henhouse before something got in and killed her chickens. She needed to finish the mending she had promised to Mrs. Henderson by the end of the week. But as Eleanor finally settled into her bed that night, listening to the familiar creaks and sighs of the house around her, she allowed herself a moment to remember the warmth in Garrett's eyes and the way her heart had lifted when he called her brave. It was a small thing, perhaps, but in a life that had become so hard and so lonely, small things mattered a great deal. The next morning dawned clear and already warm, promising another hot day typical of Arizona territory in late June 1882. Eleanor rose with the sun, as she always did, and went about her morning chores. She fed the chickens, collected eggs, milked her one remaining cow, and made herself a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush and coffee. Then she saddled her horse, a sturdy mare named Juniper, and rode out to check on her small herd. The cattle were scattered across the southern section of her property, grazing on the sparse grass that grew near a narrow creek. Eleanor counted them carefully, relieved to find that all 30 were present and accounted for. She rode among them slowly, checking for injuries or signs of illness, but they seemed healthy enough. The problem was not the quality of her cattle but the quantity. 30 head was barely enough to sustain a ranch, even a small one. She needed at least twice that many to make a real profit, but rebuilding would take time and money she did not have. She was just turning Juniper back toward the house when she spotted a rider approaching from the east. Eleanor's hand instinctively went to the rifle she kept in her saddle holster, but she relaxed when she recognized the horse and rider. It was Garrett. He rode up with an easy grace, sitting his horse like a man who had been born in the saddle. "Morning, Miss Eleanor," he called out as he drew closer. "Good morning, Garrett," Eleanor replied, surprised and pleased in equal measure. "What brings you out this way?" Garrett reined in his horse, a handsome chestnut gelding, and pushed his hat back slightly. "I hope you do not mind the intrusion, but I was thinking about what you said yesterday about needing help with the ranch. I have Sundays off from the Double R, and I thought maybe I could lend a hand, if you were interested, that is." Eleanor stared at him, certain she had misheard. "You want to help me, for free?" "Well, I would not say no to a home-cooked meal if you were offering," Garrett said with a slight smile, "but yes, essentially for free. I have been working ranches since I was 14 years old, Miss Eleanor. I know good land when I see it, and I know hard work when I see that too. You have both here. Seems a shame to let it go to waste just because you do not have an extra pair of hands." Eleanor's pride warred with her practical sense. She desperately needed help, but accepting it from Garrett felt like crossing some invisible line. And yet, what choice did she have? She could either accept his offer and perhaps have a chance at making the ranch viable again, or she could refuse and watch everything her father had built slowly crumble around her. "Why would you do this?" she asked finally. "You do not know me, you owe me nothing." Garrett's expression grew more serious, and he looked out across the land for a moment before answering. "My mother was widowed when I was 12, he said quietly. "My father was killed in a range war down in Texas. After he died, people treated her the way Morrison treated you yesterday. Like she was a burden, like she had no right to try to keep going. But she did keep going, and she raised 4 children on her own, and she did not let anyone tell her she could not do it." He looked back at Eleanor, and there was something fierce and protective in his eyes. "I helped her as much as I could, but I was just a boy. Now I am a man, and when I see another woman in a similar situation, I figure I can do what I wished someone had done for my mother. I can help." Eleanor felt her throat tighten with emotion. "What happened to her, your mother?" "She is doing well," Garrett said, and there was pride in his voice. "She still has the small farm we worked, and my younger sister lives with her now. My brothers and I send money when we can. She made it through, but it was harder than it needed to be just because she was a woman alone." Eleanor understood then that this was not pity, nor was it charity in the condescending sense. This was one person who had seen hardship helping another person through their own. It was solidarity, and that made all the difference. "I would be grateful for your help," she said. "And yes, I can manage a home-cooked meal. It has been a while since I cooked for anyone but myself." Garrett's face broke into a genuine smile, and Eleanor realized it was the first time she had seen him really smile. It transformed his features, making him look younger and almost boyish despite the weathering of sun and wind. "Well then, where should we start?" They spent the rest of the morning working together. Garrett proved to be as skilled as he claimed, and more than that, he was a good teacher. When Eleanor struggled to repair the henhouse, he showed her a better way to brace the boards. When she mentioned that her water trough had a leak, he found the crack and sealed it with pitch. He worked steadily and without complaint, and he treated Eleanor not as a helpless woman but as a fellow rancher who simply needed an extra set of hands. By noon, they had accomplished more than Eleanor usually managed in 3 days. She invited Garrett inside, suddenly self-conscious about her small, plain house. But if he thought anything of it, he did not show it. He simply removed his hat and took the seat she offered at the table. Eleanor prepared a meal of fried ham, beans, and fresh bread she had baked the day before. It was simple fare, but Garrett ate with evident appreciation, complimenting her cooking in a way that seemed genuine rather than polite. "This is the best meal I have had in months," he said. "The bunkhouse cook at the Double R means well, but everything tastes like it has been boiled in old boots." Eleanor laughed, the sound surprising her. She could not remember the last time she had laughed out loud. "I will take that as a compliment, even if it is a rather backhanded one." "It was meant as a sincere compliment," Garrett said, his eyes crinkling with amusement. "Though I suppose it does not say much for the competition." They talked as they ate, and Eleanor found herself opening up in ways she had not expected. She told Garrett about her father, about how he had come to Arizona Territory in 1870 with dreams of building something lasting. She told him about learning to ride and rope alongside the ranch hands, about the way her father had never treated her as less capable simply because she was a girl. Garrett, in turn, told her about his childhood in Texas, about the violence of the range war that had killed his father, about the years of struggle that followed. He spoke of his siblings with obvious affection and his mother with deep respect. He also told her about his decision to leave Texas 3 years ago, looking for work and a fresh start. "I have worked a dozen different ranches between Texas and here," he said. "Some good, some not so good. The Double R is decent, Richardson is a fair boss, and the pay is steady. But I have been starting to think about what comes next, you know. I will not be young forever, and working as a hired hand does not leave much to show for it when you are old." "What would you want to do?" Eleanor asked, genuinely curious. Garrett was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "I have always thought it would be nice to have my own place," he said finally. "Nothing huge, just a small spread where I could run some cattle, maybe raise horses, build a house, put down roots. But land is not cheap, and saving money on a cowboy's wages takes time." Eleanor nodded, understanding the frustration in his voice. Land meant security, meant a future, but it was also out of reach for so many people. She had it only because of her father, and now she was at risk of losing it simply because she could not manage the work alone. "Well," she said, trying to lighten the mood, "if you keep helping me on Sundays, at least you will get a decent meal out of it. That is something." Garrett smiled at her across the table, and there was something warm and intent in his gaze that made Eleanor's breath catch. "Yes," he said softly, "that is definitely something." The weeks that followed fell into a pattern that became the brightest part of Eleanor's difficult life. Every Sunday, Garrett would ride out to her ranch early in the morning, and they would work together until late afternoon. Slowly but surely, the place began to look less like a property on the verge of collapse and more like a working ranch again. Garrett helped her mend fences, repair the barn roof, clear brush, and tend to the cattle. He taught her things her father had never gotten around to showing her: how to shoe a horse properly, how to doctor a sick calf, how to read the signs of weather in the clouds and wind. In return, Eleanor cooked him meals that she took increasing pride in, trying new recipes from her mother's old cookbook, and enjoying the way his face lit up when he tasted something particularly good. But more than the work, more than the meals, what Eleanor treasured most were the conversations. She and Garrett talked about everything: their pasts, their hopes, their opinions on topics ranging from politics to philosophy to the best way to break a stubborn horse. Eleanor discovered that Garrett was well-read despite his limited formal education, and he discovered that she had a sharp wit and a way of seeing the world that challenged and intrigued him. There were moments when the air between them seemed to thicken with something unspoken, moments when their hands would brush while working and both would freeze, aware of each other in a way that went beyond friendship. But neither of them pushed it, both cautious for their own reasons. Eleanor had given up on the idea of marriage years ago. She knew she was not the kind of woman men wanted, too independent, too opinionated, too comfortable with hard work and horses. The few times men had shown interest in her, it had been clear they wanted her to give up her life and mold herself into their idea of a proper wife. She had refused, choosing loneliness over losing herself, but Garrett was different. He never tried to change her, never suggested that she was doing anything wrong by running her ranch. Instead, he seemed to admire her strength, and he treated her as an equal in a way that no other man ever had. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. One Sunday in late July, they were working together to sort through a pile of old tack in the barn, determining what could be repaired and what was beyond saving. The day was brutally hot, and even in the shade of the barn, sweat ran down Eleanor's back and plastered her hair to her forehead. "I think we have earned a break," Garrett said, setting down the bridle he had been examining. "Want to walk down to the creek? It is cooler there." Eleanor agreed readily, and they made their way down the gentle slope to where the creek ran through her property. It was not much, barely more than a stream, really. But it was shaded by a few cottonwood trees, and the sound of the water was pleasant. They sat on the bank, and Eleanor pulled off her boots, sighing with relief as she dipped her feet into the cool water. Garrett did the same, and for a few minutes they simply sat in comfortable silence. "I have been thinking," Garrett said finally, his voice careful, "about your cattle situation." Eleanor tensed slightly, unsure where this was going. "What about it?" 30 head is not enough to sustain the ranch long-term," he said. "You know that, and I know that. But what if there was a way to increase your herd without having to buy more cattle?" "I am listening," Eleanor said. "Richardson, my boss at the Double R, he has been talking about needing to reduce his herd size. He has more cattle than he can easily manage, and he is getting older and thinking about scaling back. What if I talked to him about a sort of partnership? He could move some of his cattle to your land where they could graze and be tended. In exchange, he would pay you a fee, and at the end of a set period, you would get to keep a portion of the calves born here." Eleanor turned to look at him, her mind racing through the implications. "That could work," she said slowly. "It would give me income and help rebuild my herd without requiring money I do not have. But why would Richardson agree to that?" "Because your land is good and it is not being fully used right now," Garrett said. "And because I think I can convince him that it is a sound business arrangement. Richardson is fair, but he is also smart. If I present it the right way, he will see the benefit." "And what is in it for you?" Eleanor asked, the question out before she could stop herself. Garrett looked at her, and there was something vulnerable in his expression that made her heart race. "I want to see you succeed," he said simply. "I want to know that you do not have to struggle the way you have been. I want," he stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. "I want to help." That is all. But Eleanor knew it was not all, could see it in the way he looked at her, could feel it in the charge that ran through the air between them. Her mouth went dry, and she found herself leaning slightly toward him, drawn by something she could not name. "Garrett," she said softly, and his name on her lips felt like a confession. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed a strand of hair back from her face. His fingers lingered for just a moment against her cheek, and Eleanor's eyes fluttered closed at the tenderness of the gesture. "Eleanor," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I need you to know that this is not just about helping someone in need. I mean, it started that way maybe, but it has become something different. You have become important to me, very important." Eleanor opened her eyes and found him looking at her with an intensity that stole her breath. "You have become important to me too," she admitted. "I look forward to Sundays in a way that has nothing to do with getting work done." Garrett's face broke into a slow smile. "Good," he said. "That is very good to know." He leaned in, slowly enough that Eleanor could have stopped him, but she did not want to. When his lips touched hers, it was gentle and questioning, a kiss that asked permission even as it was happening. Eleanor answered by pressing closer, her hand coming up to rest against his chest where she could feel the rapid beating of his heart. The kiss deepened, becoming more certain, and Eleanor felt as though something inside her was blooming, unfurling like a flower that had been waiting for sun. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard, and Garrett rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that for weeks," he confessed. "I have wanted you to do that for weeks," Eleanor replied, and they both laughed, the sound bright and full of joy. They sat by the creek for a long time, talking and occasionally kissing, the world narrowing down to just the two of them and the sound of the water and the dappled sunlight through the cottonwood leaves. Eleanor felt as though she were discovering a part of herself she had not known existed, a part that could be soft and vulnerable and open to another person. But as the afternoon wore on, and Garrett finally had to leave to make it back to the Double R before dark, reality began to creep back in. Eleanor stood at her gate and watched him ride away, her fingers pressed to her lips, still able to feel the ghost of his kiss. She was falling in love with him. It was a truth that was both exhilarating and frightening. Because love meant vulnerability, meant giving someone the power to hurt you, and Eleanor had spent so long protecting herself that the idea of opening up completely was terrifying. But as she walked back to her house, she decided that some risks were worth taking. Garrett was worth taking a risk for. Over the next few weeks, their relationship deepened in ways that felt both natural and profound. Garrett did indeed speak to Richardson about the cattle arrangement, and to Eleanor's surprise and relief, the older rancher agreed. By mid-August, 50 head of Double R cattle had been moved to Eleanor's land, with a contract stipulating that she would receive a monthly payment for their upkeep and keep 25% of any calves born on her property. It was not a fortune, but it was enough to give Eleanor some breathing room, enough to allow her to stop worrying quite so much about where her next meal would come from. And more than that, it gave her hope that she might actually be able to make the ranch work. Garrett's visits were no longer confined to Sundays. He began stopping by after work some evenings, ostensibly to check on the Double R cattle, but really to see Eleanor. They would sit on her porch as the sun set, talking and holding hands, and sometimes they would kiss, each kiss feeling like a small miracle. The people in Copper Springs noticed, of course. A man and a woman spending time together did not go unremarked, especially when the woman was someone like Eleanor, who had already defied convention by trying to run a ranch alone. There were whispers and speculation, some kind and some not so kind. Eleanor tried not to let it bother her, but one afternoon when she went into town for supplies, she overheard two women talking outside the church. "It is shameful, if you ask me," one of them said, her voice carrying clearly. "First she refuses to do the decent thing and move away, and now she is carrying on with that cowboy. Mark my words, no good will come of it." "Well, what do you expect from a woman like that?" the other replied. "No proper upbringing, raised running wild on that ranch. She does not know how to behave like a lady." Eleanor's face burned, but she held her head high and walked past them without comment. She would not give them the satisfaction of knowing they had hurt her. But that evening, when Garrett came by, she found herself telling him about it, unable to keep the hurt and anger from her voice. "They act as though I am some kind of fallen woman just because I am trying to survive," she said, pacing back and forth on her porch. "As though there is something wrong with me for not giving up and crawling away to die somewhere quietly." Garrett listened, his expression growing darker as she spoke. When she finally stopped, breathing hard from the force of her emotion, he stood and took her hands in his. "Eleanor," he said firmly, "those women do not matter. Their opinions do not matter. You are one of the strongest, most admirable people I have ever met, and I will not have you doubting yourself because a couple of small-minded gossips have nothing better to do than tear others down." "But what if they are right?" Eleanor said, hating the weakness in her voice. "What if I am ruining your reputation by association? You have to live in this town too, Garrett. You have to work with these people." "I do not care," Garrett said, and the fierce conviction in his voice made Eleanor look up at him in surprise. I do not care what they think about me, and I do not care if they approve. I care about you. You are what matters to me." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. "I care about you too," she whispered. "So much that it scares me sometimes." Garrett pulled her into his arms, and Eleanor pressed her face against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other as the last light faded from the sky and the stars began to emerge overhead. As summer gave way to fall, Eleanor's ranch continued to improve. The combination of the income from Richardson's cattle and Garrett's steady help meant that she was not just surviving but beginning to thrive. She was able to hire a part-time hand to help with some of the heavier work, a young man named Tommy who was eager to learn and did not care that his boss was a woman. Eleanor's own small herd had grown as well. Several of her cows had calved in the spring, and she had managed to buy 3 more head with some of the money she earned from the Richardson arrangement. It was slow going, but it was progress, and that meant everything. Her relationship with Garrett continued to deepen as well. By October, they were openly courting, and while that did not stop the gossip, it at least gave it a more respectable veneer. Garrett had made his intentions clear, both to Eleanor and to anyone who asked. He was serious about her, and he did not care who knew it. One cool evening in late October, Garrett arrived at Eleanor's ranch carrying a bundle wrapped in cloth. Eleanor met him at the door, curious about what he had brought. "What is that?" she asked. "A gift," Garrett said, looking slightly nervous. "I hope you like it." Eleanor unwrapped the cloth to find a beautiful leather bridle, hand-tooled with an intricate pattern of flowers and vines. It was clearly expensive and clearly made with great care. "Garrett, this is beautiful," Eleanor breathed, running her fingers over the detailed work. "But you should not have spent so much." "I wanted to," Garrett said. "You have been working so hard, and I wanted you to have something nice, something that was just for you." Eleanor looked up at him, her heart full to bursting. "Thank you," she said. "I love it." She stopped, the word catching in her throat, suddenly afraid to say it out loud. But Garrett understood. He always understood. "I love you too," he said softly. "I have been wanting to tell you for a while now, but I was not sure if it was too soon." "It is not too soon," Eleanor said, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I love you, Garrett. I think I have loved you since the day you paid my tab at Morrison's store." Garrett kissed her then, deep and passionate, and Eleanor felt as though her entire world had shifted, realigned around this moment, this man, this love that had grown from an act of simple kindness into something profound and unshakable. When they finally broke apart, Garrett took a deep breath and seemed to steel himself for something. "Eleanor, there is something I need to ask you, and I want you to think about it seriously before you answer." Eleanor's heart began to race. She thought she knew what was coming, but she hardly dared to hope. Garrett took both of her hands in his. "I know we have only been courting for a few months, but I also feel like I have known you much longer than that. You are my best friend and the woman I admire most in this world. I want to spend my life with you, helping you build this ranch, building a life together. Eleanor Hartwell, will you marry me?" The tears came in earnest now, but they were tears of joy. "Yes," Eleanor said, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you." Garrett whooped with joy and picked her up, spinning her around right there on the porch. When he set her down, they were both laughing and crying, and Eleanor thought she had never been happier in her entire life. They were married in early November, in a simple ceremony at the small church in Copper Springs. Eleanor wore her mother's wedding dress, which she had carefully altered to fit her own frame, and Garrett wore a new suit he had purchased especially for the occasion. Richardson served as Garrett's best man, and Sarah Henderson, one of the few women in town who had always been kind to Eleanor, stood up as her witness. The ceremony itself was brief, but when the minister pronounced them husband and wife and Garrett kissed her, Eleanor felt as though she were sealing not just a marriage but a partnership, a joining of 2 lives that had both known hardship and had found in each other something worth fighting for. The reception was held at Eleanor's ranch. Their ranch now, she reminded herself with a thrill. It was a modest affair, with food contributed by various guests and music provided by a fiddler from town. Not everyone they had invited came. Some people still disapproved of Eleanor and her unconventional life, and they showed their disapproval through absence. But Eleanor found she did not care. The people who mattered were there, and that was enough. As the sun set and the party began to wind down, Eleanor and Garrett stood together on the porch of what was now their home, watching the last of the guests depart. "Happy?" Garrett asked, slipping his arm around her waist. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Eleanor admitted. "6 months ago, I thought my life was over, that I would lose everything and end up alone. And now look at us. We are going to build something wonderful here," Garrett said confidently. "I can feel it." Eleanor leaned into him, feeling safe and loved and full of hope for the future. "We already have," she said softly. The winter that followed was cold but joyful. Garrett moved his few possessions into Eleanor's house, and together they made it truly theirs, adding touches that reflected both of their personalities. Garrett built new shelves for Eleanor's growing collection of books, and Eleanor made curtains and a new quilt for their bed. Working the ranch together was different now that they were married. They fell into an easy rhythm, each knowing instinctively where the other was needed. Garrett's expertise complemented Eleanor's knowledge of the land, and together they were able to accomplish far more than either could have alone. The double R cattle continued to thrive on their land, and in February, the calving season began. Eleanor and Garrett worked around the clock to ensure that both the double R calves and their own were delivered safely. It was exhausting work, but also deeply satisfying. By the time spring arrived, they had increased their personal herd to nearly 50 head, a number that seemed almost miraculous compared to the 30 Eleanor had been struggling to maintain a year earlier. The income from the cattle, combined with Eleanor's continued mending work and the eggs from an expanded chicken flock, meant that they were not just surviving but actually saving money. One April evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, Eleanor shared some news that she had been both excited and nervous to reveal. "Garrett," she said, taking his hand, "I need to tell you something." He looked at her with immediate concern. "What is it? Is something wrong?" "No, nothing is wrong," Eleanor said quickly. "At least I do not think so. I am with child." Garrett's face went through a series of expressions, surprise, then joy, then wonder, before he pulled her into a tight embrace. "Eleanor, that is wonderful. Are you sure?" "I am sure," Eleanor said, laughing at his enthusiasm. "I have suspected for a few weeks, but I wanted to be certain before I told you. How are you feeling? Are you well? Do you need to rest? Should you be working as hard as you have been?" The questions tumbled out of Garrett in a rush, and Eleanor laughed again. "I am fine," she assured him. "The doctor in town confirmed it yesterday when I went in for supplies. He said I am healthy and the baby is due in late October." Garrett placed his hand gently on her still flat stomach, his expression one of awe. "A baby," he said softly. "Our baby, I can hardly believe it." "I know," Eleanor said. "When I think about where I was a year ago, alone and struggling and thinking I had no future, and now I have you and the ranch is thriving and we are going to have a child, it feels like a dream." "It is not a dream," Garrett said, kissing her forehead. "It is real, and it is ours, and we are going to give this child the best life we possibly can." The months of Eleanor's pregnancy passed in a blur of preparation and hard work. Garrett became even more protective, insisting that Eleanor not overdo it, though she continued to work as much as she felt able. They converted a small corner of their bedroom into a nursery area, and Eleanor sewed baby clothes while Garrett built a beautiful wooden cradle. The people of Copper Springs, seeing that Eleanor and Garrett's marriage was clearly a happy and successful one, gradually began to soften their attitudes. Even Morrison at the general store became marginally more civil, though he never quite apologized for his earlier treatment of Eleanor. In late October, just as the leaves on the cottonwood trees by the creek were turning gold, Eleanor went into labor. Garrett rode frantically into town to fetch the doctor and Sarah Henderson, who had agreed to serve as midwife. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Garrett, pacing outside the bedroom door, was nearly overcome with fear. But finally, as dawn was breaking, he heard the sound he had been waiting for, the strong, healthy cry of a newborn baby. Sarah opened the door, her face tired but smiling. "You can come in now," she said. "You have a son." Garrett entered the room to find Eleanor propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. He approached slowly, almost afraid to breathe, and when Eleanor pulled back the blanket to show him their son's face, he felt his throat close up with emotion. "He is perfect," Garrett whispered, gently touching the baby's tiny hand. The infant's fingers immediately wrapped around his larger one, and Garrett felt a surge of love so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. "What should we name him?" Eleanor asked softly. They had discussed names over the past months but had never quite settled on one. Now, looking at his son, Garrett thought of his own father, the man he had lost too young, the man he wished could have met his grandson. "What about Samuel?" he suggested. "After my father, Samuel James Garrett," Eleanor smiled. "Samuel James Garrett," she repeated. "I think that is perfect." The months following Samuel's birth were some of the happiest and most exhausting of their lives. The baby was healthy and strong-lunged, and he kept both Eleanor and Garrett busy day and night. But there was also a joy in those sleepless nights, in the way Samuel would grasp their fingers, in his first smile, in every small milestone. Garrett proved to be a devoted father, helping with the baby whenever he was not working the ranch. He would walk Samuel around the property, pointing out the cattle and the horses and the wide Arizona sky, telling his son about the land they were building together. The ranch continued to prosper. By the spring of 1884, they had expanded their herd to over 100 head, and they had enough income to hire 2 full-time ranch hands. The house was expanded as well, with Garrett and Tommy building on an additional room that could serve as a proper nursery. Life was not without its challenges. There were hard winters and dry summers, sick cattle and injured horses, and all the 100 other difficulties that came with ranching life. But Eleanor and Garrett faced them together, and that made all the difference. On Samuel's 2nd birthday, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant again. This time the news was met with excitement rather than nervous anticipation. They knew what to expect now, and they were ready. Their daughter was born in June of 1885, an easier birth than Samuel's had been. They named her Rose, after Eleanor's mother, and she proved to be a calm, sweet-tempered baby who seemed content to simply observe the world around her with wide, curious eyes. With 2 children, the house felt truly full and alive in a way it never had before. Samuel, now a sturdy toddler, was fascinated by his baby sister and would sit beside her cradle for long periods, patting her hand gently and telling her stories in his babbling toddler language. Eleanor sometimes found herself stopping in the middle of her work to simply look around and marvel at what her life had become. She would watch Garrett teaching Samuel to sit on a horse, or see Rose sleeping peacefully in the cradle he had made, or stand on the porch and survey the ranch that was now thriving and successful, and she would feel a gratitude so profound it was almost painful. One evening, as they sat on the porch after putting the children to bed, Garrett voiced something similar. "Do you ever think about that day in Morrison's store?" he asked. "The day we met, often," Eleanor admitted. "It was one of the worst days of my life at the time. I was so humiliated, so afraid that I was going to lose everything. I almost did not say anything," Garrett confessed. "I thought about just letting it go, not getting involved, but something made me speak up. I am glad I did." "I am glad too," Eleanor said, taking his hand. "You saved me that day, Garrett, not just by paying for my supplies, but by seeing me as someone worth saving. No one else did that." "You saved yourself," Garrett corrected gently. "You were already doing the hard work, already fighting to keep this place going. I just helped a little." "You did more than help a little," Eleanor said. You gave me hope, and then you gave me love, and then you gave me this life, this family, everything I have now." Garrett pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "We gave each other all of that," he said. "Neither of us could have done it alone." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling down for the night. In the distance, cattle lowed softly, and somewhere an owl hooted. The air was cooling, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of another beautiful day tomorrow. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. Samuel grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved the ranch and everything about it. He followed his father everywhere, eager to learn and help, and Garrett was endlessly patient in teaching him. Rose, as she grew, proved to be quieter but no less determined, with a particular affinity for the horses and a gentle way with animals that reminded Eleanor of her own father. In 1888, Eleanor gave birth to their third child, another son they named Thomas after Garrett's younger brother. Thomas was a cheerful, easygoing baby who grew into a cheerful, easygoing child, acting as a sort of peacemaker between his older siblings when they squabbled. The ranch continued to expand and prosper. By 1890, they were running over 300 head of cattle and had become one of the more successful mid-sized operations in the territory. They had built a proper barn, expanded the house again, and even installed a windmill to pump water more efficiently. Eleanor had also become something of a quiet advocate for other women trying to make their way in the harsh territory. When a widow named Martha Collins found herself in a situation similar to Eleanor's own years earlier, Eleanor was the first to offer help and advice. She worked with Garrett and Richardson to set up a similar cattle-sharing arrangement, and she made sure Martha knew she had allies and friends. Word spread, and over the years, several other women in difficult circumstances found their way to Eleanor's door, looking for guidance and support. Eleanor never turned anyone away. She remembered too well what it felt like to be alone and desperate, and she was determined to ensure that other women did not have to face what she had faced. Morrison's general store eventually changed hands, sold to a younger man who was far more progressive in his thinking. The new owner, Michael Chen, was the son of Chinese immigrants, and he had faced his own share of discrimination. He and Eleanor became friends, united by their shared understanding of what it meant to be outsiders fighting for respect and success. The children grew, and the ranch grew with them. Samuel, at 18, was already as skilled a rancher as his father, and he had begun courting a nice girl from town, the daughter of the schoolteacher. Rose, at 16, was helping her mother not just with the ranch, but also with the informal network of support they had built for women in need. Thomas, at 14, had developed an unexpected talent for working with horses, and he had begun breaking and training young stock with remarkable skill. One evening in the summer of 1896, 14 years after that fateful day in Morrison's store, Eleanor and Garrett sat on their porch, a much larger, nicer porch now, and watched the sunset together as they had done thousands of times before. "Do you ever regret it?" Eleanor asked. "Staying here, tying yourself to me and this ranch instead of moving on to find your own land somewhere else?" Garrett turned to look at her, surprise evident in his face, which now bore a few more lines and threads of silver in his hair. "Regret it? Eleanor, this is my land, this is my home. How could I possibly regret the best decision I ever made? I just mean that you could have had your own place, your own start, if you had not spent so much time helping me," Eleanor said. "This is my own place," Garrett said firmly. "I know it started as your father's ranch and then yours, but we have built it together, Eleanor. Every fence, every building, every head of cattle, we did that together. This is as much mine as it is yours, not because of any legal document, but because of the work and love we have put into it. And more than that, I have you and our children, and that is worth more than any amount of land could ever be." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, even after all these years, moved by the depth of Garrett's love for her. "I love you," she said simply. "I do not say it enough, but I do." I love you so much. I love you too, Garrett replied, pulling her close. Every day, more than the day before. They sat together as the sky turned from gold to pink to purple, holding hands and reflecting on the life they had built. It had not been easy, and there had been times when Eleanor had wondered if they would make it. But they had persevered, supported each other, loved each other through every difficulty. In 1897, Samuel married his sweetheart, Abigail, in a beautiful ceremony at the expanded church in Copper Springs. The reception was held at the ranch, which was now large and prosperous enough to accommodate a substantial gathering. Eleanor watched her son dance with his new wife and felt a profound sense of completion. The boy who had been born into a home filled with love and hope was now starting his own family, carrying forward the values and strength that she and Garrett had tried to instill in him. Samuel and Abigail built a small house on the eastern edge of the ranch property, and Samuel continued to work alongside his father and brother in running the operation. When their first child was born in 1898, a daughter they named Eleanor after her grandmother, Eleanor held her namesake and marveled at the continuity of it all, at how life moved forward in these beautiful, unexpected ways. Rose, who had always been more independent than her brothers, announced in 1899 that she wanted to become a teacher. It was an unusual ambition for a ranch girl, but Eleanor and Garrett supported her completely. Rose attended the Teachers' College in Tucson, and upon graduation, she returned to Copper Springs to teach at the local school. She eventually married a lawyer from Phoenix, a man who respected her intelligence and her dedication to education. Thomas took over much of the horse breeding operation, developing a reputation throughout the territory for producing quality stock. He married a girl from a neighboring ranch, and they built their home near Samuel's, creating a sort of family compound on the ranch property. As the new century dawned, Eleanor and Garrett, now in their 40s, began to step back from the day-to-day operations of the ranch, trusting their sons to take over much of the work. They had earned the right to take things a bit easier, to spend more time with their growing number of grandchildren, to simply enjoy the fruits of their decades of hard labor. One afternoon in the spring of 1902, Eleanor was working in the garden she had planted behind the house when she heard a familiar voice calling her name. She looked up to see Garrett approaching, a smile on his face. "I have something to show you," he said, offering his hand to help her up. Curious, Eleanor followed him around to the front of the house, where she found a beautiful new buckboard wagon, freshly painted and fitted with comfortable seats. "I thought we could use a new wagon," Garrett explained. "Something nice for when we want to go into town or visit the children. We have spent 20 years working ourselves to the bone. Maybe it is time we enjoyed ourselves a little." Eleanor walked around the wagon, admiring the craftsmanship. "It is beautiful," she said, "but we do not need anything fancy." "Maybe we do not need it," Garrett agreed. "But I wanted to get it for you anyway. You deserve nice things, Eleanor. You have earned them 1,000 times over." Eleanor turned to him, this man who had been her partner, her love, her best friend for 20 years, and felt her heart swell with affection. He was grayer now, and there were lines around his eyes and mouth, but to her, he was as handsome as the day he had walked into Morrison's store and changed her life forever. "Thank you," she said softly, "for this and for everything, for seeing me when no one else did. For believing in me when I was struggling to believe in myself. For building this life with me." "Thank you for letting me," Garrett replied, pulling her into his arms, "for taking a chance on a drifter cowboy who had nothing to offer but his hands and his heart." "You offered everything that mattered," Eleanor said. They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other in front of the home they had built, on the land they had made prosper, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived, and a love that had endured and grown stronger through every challenge. The years continued to flow by, each one adding more grandchildren, more memories, more proof that the life Eleanor and Garrett had built was not just successful but meaningful. The ranch, now passed primarily into the hands of Samuel and Thomas, continued to thrive and expand. The family name, Garrett, became synonymous with quality cattle and fair dealing throughout Arizona Territory. Eleanor's informal network for helping women in need had evolved into something more organized, with several women in Copper Springs working together to provide assistance, advice, and advocacy. It was not a formal charity, but it made a real difference in the lives of women who might otherwise have fallen through the cracks. In 1912, Arizona achieved statehood, and the celebration in Copper Springs was grand. Eleanor and Garrett, now in their 50s, attended the festivities with their children and grandchildren, watching as the territory they had helped build became something permanent and recognized. They had been through so much together: hard times and good times, struggles and triumphs, births and deaths, and everything in between. Their hair was more gray than not now, and they moved a bit slower than they once had, but the love between them had only deepened with time. One evening in the fall of 1915, 33 years after that day in Morrison's store, Eleanor and Garrett sat on their porch and watched another sunset. Their great-grandchildren played in the yard, chasing each other and laughing, while their adult children and grandchildren gathered for a family dinner. "Can you believe it has been 33 years?" Eleanor mused. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago." "It has been a lifetime," Garrett said. "A good lifetime, the best lifetime." "Do you remember what you said to me that first day?" Eleanor asked. "When you paid my tab, I said a lot of things that day," Garrett replied with a smile. "You said I was brave," Eleanor reminded him. "That what I was doing was not foolish but brave. I think about that sometimes, about how much I needed to hear those words right then." "You were brave," Garrett said. "You still are, the bravest person I know." "We did it together," Eleanor said, echoing words they had said to each other countless times over the years. "Everything good in my life, we built it together." "Together," Garrett agreed, taking her hand. As the sun sank below the mountains and the sky turned to fire, their family gathered on the porch around them. Samuel and Abigail with their 3 grown children and 2 grandchildren, Rose and her husband visiting from Phoenix with their son, Thomas and his wife with their 4 children. The house was full of noise and love and life, exactly as Eleanor had always dreamed it could be. Someone suggested taking a family photograph, and they all arranged themselves on and around the porch, multiple generations united by the love and determination of 2 people who had refused to give up, who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances, and who had built something lasting and beautiful. As the photographer prepared his camera, Eleanor looked at Garrett and saw him looking back at her with the same warmth and devotion she had seen in his eyes that day by the creek when he first kissed her. 33 years, and that look had never changed. The photographer called for everyone to be still and smile, and Eleanor did, her heart full of gratitude for every moment, every struggle, every triumph that had led to this perfect instant. The camera flashed, capturing the image, the Garrett family, strong and successful and bound together by love. That photograph would hang in the family home for generations, a testament to what could be built when 2 people chose to face life's challenges together, when kindness was met with courage, and when love was allowed to grow and flourish against all odds. Eleanor and Garrett lived to see Arizona grow from a rough frontier territory into a proper state. They lived to see their grandchildren have children of their own. They lived to see the ranch they had built together become a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. When Garrett passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1928, at the age of 72, Eleanor was holding his hand. He had lived a full, rich life, surrounded by family and love on land he had worked with his own hands. At his funeral, attended by what seemed like half the state, person after person stood to talk about his kindness, his fairness, his devotion to his family. Eleanor lived another 5 years after Garrett's death, spending her time with her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, tending her garden, and continuing the work of helping other women find their footing in a world that was not always kind to them. She passed away in 1933 at the age of 75, in the house she had been born in, surrounded by the family she and Garrett had created. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, under the wide Arizona sky they had both loved so much. Their headstone was simple, bearing their names and dates and a single line that Samuel had chosen. Together, they built a life of love. The ranch continued for generations, passed down through the family, each generation adding to what Eleanor and Garrett had started. The story of how they met, of the storekeeper who refused credit, of the cowboy who paid the tab and walked her home, of the love that grew from that simple act of kindness, became family legend, told and retold to each new generation. It was a story about courage and perseverance, about refusing to let circumstances define you, about the power of kindness and the strength of love. It was a story about two people who had been alone and struggling, who had found each other at exactly the right moment, and who had built something that lasted far beyond their own lifetimes. And it all started on a hot day in June 1882, in a general store in Copper Springs, Arizona Territory, when a cowboy saw a woman in need and decided to help. From that single moment of compassion grew a love story that would span decades, create a family, build a legacy, and prove that sometimes the most extraordinary lives begin with the simplest acts of kindness. The ranch still stands today, still operated by descendants of Eleanor and Garrett, still testament to what can be built when two people choose love over fear, partnership over isolation, and hope over despair. And on that hill, overlooking the land they loved, two headstones stand side by side, marking the resting place of two people who had been alone and afraid and struggling, who had found each other and built a life together, and who had loved each other faithfully and completely until the very end. Their story was not one of grand gestures or dramatic rescues, though it had its share of both. It was, at its heart, a story of two ordinary people who faced extraordinary challenges and met them together, who chose each other every day, who built a life of meaning and purpose and love. It was a story that proved that sometimes all it takes to change a life is one person willing to see another's struggle, willing to step forward and help, willing to believe that everyone deserves a chance at happiness and success. Eleanor and Garrett's legacy lived on not just in the land and the cattle and the buildings, but in the values they had instilled in their children and grandchildren and all the generations that followed. Work hard, be kind, help those in need, stand up for what is right, love completely. Never give up. And perhaps most importantly, remember that a life can change in a moment, that kindness matters, that love is worth fighting for, and that together, two people can build something that will last long after they are gone. That was the legacy of Eleanor and Garrett, the cowboy and the woman alone who had found each other and built a life that became a testament to the enduring power of love, courage, and partnership. Their story, begun on that hot June day in 1882 in Morrison's general store, had come full circle, ending not with loss or sadness but with the knowledge that they had lived fully, loved completely, and left the world better than they had found it. And in the end, what more could anyone ask for?